Sherlock Holmes. The Dancing Men Code. A mystery only. He could solve. Chapter 1. The man who wasn't there. The fog clung to the streets of London like a shroud, muffling the clatter of hooves and the distant cries of newsboys. I had just returned to Baker Street after a long day at my practice, my mind weary from the mundane ailments of my patients. Holmes, as usual, was seated by the fire, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed on some invisible point in the distance. "Ah, Watson," he said without turning, "you've arrived just in time. A most singular case has presented itself." I hung my coat and hat, grateful for the warmth of the room. "Singular, you say? What manner of case?" Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with that peculiar intensity I had come to associate with his most intriguing puzzles. "A man has vanished, Watson, not merely from sight, but from existence itself." I raised an eyebrow. "Surely you exaggerate, Holmes. Men do not simply cease to exist." "And yet," he replied, "Inspector Lestrade would have us believe otherwise. He arrived not an hour ago, quite beside himself. A gentleman by the name of Henry Acton has been reported missing by his wife. But here is the peculiarity. No record of his existence can be found. No birth certificate, no employment records, no trace of him in any official capacity. Even his neighbours claim they have never heard of him." I frowned, settling into my chair. A clerical error, perhaps, or a case of mistaken identity. Holmes shook his head. "Too convenient, Watson. Too deliberate. Mrs. Acton is adamant that her husband was real, that they shared a life together for over a decade, and yet the world insists he never was." He handed me a photograph, its edges slightly frayed. It depicted a man in his late 40s, with a stern expression and a neatly trimmed moustache. "Mrs. Acton provided this," Holmes said. "She claims it was taken last year. But when Lestrade showed it to her neighbours, they swore they had never seen the man before." I studied the photograph, a strange unease settling in my chest. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" "I make nothing of it, yet," he replied. "But I intend to. There is a thread here, Watson, however faint, and I mean to pull it until the entire tapestry unravels." The following morning found us at the Acton residence, a modest townhouse in a quiet corner of Kensington. Mrs. Acton, a woman of perhaps 40 with a face etched by worry, greeted us at the door. Her hands trembled as she led us inside. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know who else to turn to. The police think I've got mad, but I swear to you, Henry was real. He is real." Holmes's gaze swept the room, taking in every detail. "Tell me everything, Mrs. Acton. Leave nothing out, no matter how trivial it may seem." She nodded, her eyes distant. "It began 3 days ago. Henry went out for his usual evening walk and never returned. At first I thought nothing of it. He often lingered at his club. But when he didn't come home by morning, I grew worried. I contacted the police, and that's when they told me there was no record of him. No one remembered him. Even his friends at the club denied knowing him." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And the photograph? You are certain it is of your husband?" "Of course," she cried, her voice breaking. "I have others too. But when I showed them to the police, they said the man in the pictures didn't match any records. It's as if he's been erased." Holmes's eyes narrowed. Erased indeed? Watson, what do you make of this? I hesitated, my rational mind struggling to reconcile the impossibility of the situation. It defies logic, Holmes. A man cannot simply vanish from memory and record. There must be an explanation. Precisely, Holmes said, his voice low, and I intend to find it. Mrs. Acton, may we examine your husband's study? She led us to a small room at the back of the house, its shelves lined with books and its desk cluttered with papers. Holmes moved with the precision of a predator, his eyes darting from one object to another. He paused at the desk, his fingers brushing against a faint indentation in the wood. "Watson," he said, "do you see this?" I leaned closer. The indentation was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it formed a pattern, a series of small, angular marks, dancing men. Holmes murmured, "How curious!" "Dancing men," I repeated, baffled. Holmes straightened, his expression unreadable. "A code, Watson, one I have encountered before. But why here, and why now?" Before I could respond, a sudden chill swept through the room. The air seemed to thicken, and for a moment I felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. Holmes' gaze met mine, and I saw in his eyes a flicker of something I had never seen before. Uncertainty. "Watson," he said quietly, "we are dealing with forces far beyond the ordinary. Be on your guard." As we left the Acton residence, the fog seemed denser than before, as if it sought to obscure not just the streets, but the truth itself. Holmes was silent, his mind undoubtedly racing through the labyrinth of clues. I, however, could not shake the feeling that we were being watched, that unseen eyes followed our every move. "Holmes," I said at last, "what do you make of it all?" He stopped, his silhouette stark against the swirling mist. "I make this, Watson. We are on the brink of a discovery that may shatter everything we know. But beware, some truths are not meant to be remembered." And with that, he turned and vanished into the fog, leaving me to wonder if I too might soon forget the man who wasn't there. Chapter 2. The House That No One Remembers. The fog had thickened by the time Holmes and I reached Kensington, the gas lamps casting faint halos of light that barely pierced the gloom. The address Mrs. Acton had provided led us to a narrow street, lined with row houses, their facades worn by time and weather. Holmes strode ahead, his keen eyes scanning the numbers above each door. "Number 27, he murmured, stopping abruptly. "This should be it." I glanced at the house before us. It was unremarkable, a 3-story townhouse with peeling paint and a sagging roof. Yet something about it felt off. The windows were dark, and the air around it seemed unnaturally still, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Holmes rapped sharply on the door. No answer. He tried the handle, and to my surprise, it turned easily. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit foyer. "Curious," Holmes said, stepping inside. "No lock, no resistance, almost as if it were waiting for us." I followed, my unease growing with each step. The interior was sparsely furnished, the air heavy with the scent of dust and decay. A staircase led to the upper floors, its banister slick with grime. Holmes moved with purpose, his gaze darting from one detail to another. "Watson," he said, pointing to the floor, "do you see these?" I crouched to examine the faint marks in the dust. They were footprints, small, precise, and leading deeper into the house. A woman's shoes, Holmes deduced. Recent, given the lack of additional dust over them. Mrs. Acton, perhaps? But why would she come here? I asked. A question worth answering, Holmes replied, his voice low. Come, let us see what secrets this house holds. Moved through the ground floor, finding little of note until we reached a study at the back of the house. The room was cluttered with books and papers, the desk piled high with documents. Holmes began sifting through them, his movements quick and efficient. Watson, he said, holding up a sheet of paper. What do you make of this? I took the paper and examined it. It was covered in the same angular symbols we had seen on Henry Acton's desk, the Dancing Men Code. Beneath the symbols was a single line of text. The truth lies where the past is forgotten. A riddle, I said, frowning. But what does it mean? Holmes's eyes gleamed. It means we are on the right path. This house, Watson, is no ordinary dwelling. It is a repository of secrets, a place where the archivists store their altered records. Before I could respond, a sound from above froze us in place. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The creak of a floorboard. Someone's here, I whispered. Holmes nodded, his expression grim. Stay close, Watson. We are not alone. We ascended the staircase, each step careful and deliberate. The upper floor was darker, the air colder. A narrow hallway stretched before us, lined with doors. Holmes paused at the first, his hand hovering over the knob. Ready? He murmured. I nodded, my heart pounding. He turned the knob and pushed the door open, revealing a small bedroom. The room was empty, save for a single chair positioned in the centre. On the chair lay a photograph, a portrait of Henry Acton, his face frozen in a moment of quiet despair. Holmes, I said, my voice trembling. This is unsettling. He picked up the photograph, his fingers tracing the edges. A message, Watson, a reminder that we are being watched. As he spoke, a sudden noise from the hallway made us both turn. A shadow flickered at the edge of my vision, there and gone in an instant. Holmes was out the door in a flash, his footsteps echoing down the hall. I followed, my breath coming in short gasps. We reached the end of the hallway, where a narrow staircase led to the attic. Holmes hesitated for only a moment before climbing, his movements swift and silent. I stayed close, my hand gripping my revolver. The attic was dark, the only light coming from a small window at the far end. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something metallic. Holmes moved toward the window, his eyes scanning the room. Watson, he said, his voice barely audible. Look here. I joined him, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The floorboards near the window were stained, the dark patches unmistakable. Blood! This is where it happened, Holmes said, his tone grim. Where Henry Acton was taken, or erased. Before I could respond, a sound from behind made us both turn. The attic door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for my revolver, but Holmes's hand on my arm stopped me. Wait, he whispered. Listen. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of our breathing. Then faintly, a voice echoed through the darkness, a voice that sent a chill down my spine. Some truths, it said, are not meant to be remembered. The words hung in the air, their meaning clear. We were not alone, and our investigation had drawn the attention of forces far beyond our understanding. Chapter 3. The Secret Order's Shadow. The attic was pitch black, the air heavy with the scent of blood and decay. Holmes's grip on my arm tightened as the voice echoed again, its tone cold and disembodied. Some truths are not meant to be remembered, strained to see in the darkness, my revolver trembling in my hand. Holmes, however, remained eerily calm. He released my arm and took a step forward, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "Who are you?" he demanded. "Show yourself!" For a moment there was no response. Then a faint click echoed through the room, and a sliver of light appeared as the attic door creaked open. Holmes moved swiftly, pulling me toward the exit. We stumbled into the hallway, the dim light from the staircase a welcome relief. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice low and urgent, "we must leave this place now." I didn't argue. The house felt alive, as if its very walls were conspiring against us. We descended the stairs and exited through the front door. The cold night air a sharp contrast to the stifling atmosphere inside. Holmes paused on the doorstep, his gaze fixed on the house. "This is no ordinary dwelling," he murmured. "It is a trap, a carefully constructed illusion designed to ensnare the curious." "But who would go to such lengths?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and unease. "The archivists, Watson. They are far more powerful and far more dangerous than I had anticipated." We made our way back to Baker Street, the fog swallowing the city around us. Holmes was silent for much of the journey, his mind undoubtedly racing through the labyrinth of clues we had uncovered. I, however, could not shake the feeling that we were being watched, that unseen eyes followed our every move. Upon our return, Holmes immediately set to work, spreading the documents we had taken from the house across the sitting-room table. The Dancing Men Code was prominently displayed, its angular symbols seeming to mock us with their secrecy. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice breaking the silence, "what do you make of this?" He handed me a sheet of paper covered in the same cryptic symbols, but this time there was a single word written beneath them: "Archivum." "Latin for archive," I said, frowning. "A reference to the archivists?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "But more than that, it is a clue. The archivists are not merely erasing individuals, they are rewriting history itself. This house, Watson, is but one of their repositories. There are others scattered across the city, perhaps across the world." I felt a chill run down my spine. But to what end? Why go to such lengths to alter history? Holmes's expression darkened. "Power, Watson. Absolute power. If one controls the past, one controls the present and the future. The archivists are not merely a secret society. They are architects of reality." Before I could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Holmes rose, his movements deliberate, and opened it to reveal Inspector Lestrade, his face pale and drawn. "Holmes," Lestrade said, his voice trembling, "you must come at once. There's been an incident." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "What kind of incident?" Lestrade hesitated, his eyes darting to me before returning to Holmes. "It's Henry Acton's wife. She's gone." "Gone?" I repeated, my stomach tightening. What do you mean gone? Vanished, Lestrade said. One moment she was there, the next, poof, like she never existed. And the worst part is, no one remembers her. Not her neighbours, not her friends, no one. It's as if she's been erased, just like her husband. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Take us to her house, Lestrade, now. The Acton residence was eerily quiet when we arrived, the air thick with the scent of disuse. The furniture was covered in dust, the walls bare of photographs or personal effects. It was as if no one had lived there for years. This is impossible, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We were here just hours ago. Mrs. Acton was here. Holmes moved through the house with purpose, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He paused in the study, his gaze fixed on the desk where we had first seen the dancing men code. The indentation was gone, the wood smooth and unmarked. Watson, Holmes said, his voice low, do you recall the riddle we found? The truth lies where the past is forgotten. I nodded, my mind racing. You think this is connected? I know it is, Holmes replied. The archivists are not merely erasing individuals, they are erasing their entire existence, their homes, their possessions, even their memories. And they are doing it with terrifying efficiency. Lestrade, who had been silent until now, spoke up. But how, Holmes? How can someone simply vanish, as if they never were? Holmes turned to him, his expression grim. That, Inspector, is the question we must answer. And quickly, before we too are forgotten. As we left the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time. The archivists were always one step ahead, their reach extending further than we had imagined. Holmes, however, seemed undeterred. Watson, he said as we walked, we must find their headquarters. If we can locate their central archive, we may yet uncover the truth. But how? I asked. We have no leads, no clues. On the contrary, Holmes interrupted, we have the most important clue of all. The dancing men code. It is their signature, their calling card, and it will lead us to them. His confidence was reassuring, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach. The archivists were not merely a threat to our investigation, they were a threat to reality itself. And as the fog closed in around us, I couldn't help but wonder if we were already too late. Chapter 4. The First Suspect, a Perfect Alibi. The following morning found us at Scotland Yard, where Lestrade had arranged access to the few remaining records tied to Henry Acton. The room was cluttered with files and documents, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and ink. Holmes sat at a table, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes scanning the pages before him with laser focus. Watson, he said without looking up, do you recall the name of the club Henry Acton frequented? I rifled through my notes, though they felt increasingly unreliable. The Athenaeum, I believe. Mrs. Acton mentioned it during our first interview. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. Indeed, and according to these records, the club's membership roster has no mention of Henry Acton. Curious, is it not? But Mrs. Acton was certain, I replied. She described it in detail. The oak-panelled walls, the leather armchairs, Precisely, Holmes interrupted. Her description was vivid, yet the club denies his existence. This discrepancy is no accident, Watson. It is a deliberate act of erasure. Before I could respond, Lestrade entered the room, his face flushed from exertion. "Holmes, I've found something. A man who claims to have known Henry Acton, or at least someone by that name." Holmes's eyes lit up. "Where is he?" "In the interrogation room," Lestrade said. "But be warned, he's a slippery one. A businessman by the name of Edgar Whitcomb." We followed Lestrade to the interrogation room, where a man in his late 50s sat at a table, his hands clasped neatly in front of him. He was impeccably dressed, his suit tailored to perfection, his expression one of polite indifference. "Mr. Whitcomb," Holmes began, taking a seat across from him, "you claim to have known Henry Acton. Can you elaborate?" Whitcomb smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Mr. Holmes. I never said I knew him. I merely said the name sounded familiar." Holmes leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "And yet you were seen meeting with him on multiple occasions at the Fierfuf Athenaeum. How do you explain that?" Whitcomb's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he regained his composure. "I frequent many clubs, Mr. Holmes. It's possible our paths crossed, but I assure you I have no recollection of a Henry Acton." Holmes studied him for a moment before producing the photograph of Acton from his pocket. "And this man, do you recognize him?" Whitcomb glanced at the photograph, his expression unchanged. "I'm afraid not. Should I?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, would you mind stepping outside for a moment? I'd like a word with Mr. Whitcomb in private." Lestrade hesitated but complied, leaving the three of us alone. Holmes waited until the door closed before speaking again. "Mr. Whitcomb," he said, his voice low and measured, "let us dispense with the pretense. You are a member of the archivists, are you not?" Whitcomb's eyes widened, though only for a moment. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Of course you don't," Holmes replied, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But let me make this clear. Your organization's activities have not gone unnoticed. And while you may believe yourselves untouchable, I assure you, you are not." Whitcomb leaned back in his chair, his smile returning. "You're a clever man, Mr. Holmes, but you're out of your depth. The archivists are beyond your reach, beyond anyone's reach." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "We shall see." As we left the interrogation room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just crossed a line. Whitcomb's confidence was unnerving, his calm demeanour suggesting he had nothing to fear. "Holmes," I said as we walked, "do you think he's telling the truth? About not knowing Acton, I mean." Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson. He knows far more than he's letting on. But he's also right about one thing. The archivists are a formidable adversary. We must tread carefully." "What's our next move?" I asked. Holmes paused, his gaze distant. "We follow the trail of the dancing men. It is their signature, their calling card, and if I'm not mistaken, it will lead us to their central archive." That evening, we returned to Baker Street, where Holmes spent hours poring over the symbols we had collected. I watched as he meticulously transcribed them, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Watson," he said at last, "do you recall the riddle we found in the house? The truth lies where the past is forgotten." I nodded. You think it's connected to the code? I do, Holmes replied, and I believe I've deciphered part of it. The symbols correspond to locations, specific places tied to the archivist's operations. He handed me a sheet of paper with a list of addresses, each accompanied by a set of coordinates. These are the repositories, Holmes said, places where they store their altered records. And if we can locate the central archive, we may yet uncover the truth. I felt a surge of hope, though it was tempered by the knowledge of what we were up against. The archivists were not merely a secret society. They were architects of reality itself. And as I looked at the list of addresses, I couldn't help but wonder if we were walking into a trap. Chapter 5. The Dancing Men. Code revealed. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls of our Baker Street sitting room. Holmes sat at his desk. The symbols of the Dancing Men code spread before him like pieces of a puzzle. His fingers traced the angular shapes. His eyes narrowed in concentration. I watched in silence, my mind racing with questions I dared not voice. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the silence, "fetch me the atlas from the shelf, if you would." I obliged, handing him the heavy volume. He flipped through the pages with practised ease, his gaze darting between the code and the maps. "Fascinating," he murmured. "Each symbol corresponds to a specific location, a grid, if you will, mapped across London. The Dancing Men are not merely a cipher, they are a guide." I leaned closer, trying to make sense of the symbols. A guide to what, exactly? Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar spark of discovery. "To the archivist's central archive, Watson, the heart of their operation, and if I am correct—" He paused, tapping a symbol on the page. "It lies here." He pointed to a spot on the map, a nondescript area near the Thames. I frowned. "That's the old warehouse district. It's been abandoned for years." "Precisely," Holmes replied. "The perfect place to conceal something one does not wish to be found." Before I could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face pale. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling, "there's a gentleman here to see you. He says it's urgent." Holmes rose, his expression unreadable. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson." The man who entered was tall and gaunt, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He carried a leather satchel, which he clutched tightly to his chest. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low and urgent, "my name is Charles Mercer. I need your help." Holmes gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Mr. Mercer, and tell us what brings you here." Mercer hesitated before sitting, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting to be watched. "It's about the archivists," he said at last. "I was one of them, until I realized what they were truly capable of." Holmes leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Go on." Mercer opened his satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers, each covered in the same angular symbols we had been studying. "This is their code," he said, "their way of communicating. But it's more than that. It's a map to their archive." Holmes took the papers, his eyes scanning them quickly. "And why come to us now?" Mercer's hands trembled as he spoke. "Because they're erasing people, Mr. Holmes. People like me. People who know too much. I've seen it happen. One moment they're there, the next, gone, as if they never existed. I felt a chill run down my spine. "And you think you're next?" Mercer nodded, his face pale. "I know I am. That's why I came to you. If anyone can stop them, it's you." Holmes studied him for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Mercer, you've taken a great risk coming here, but you've also given us a valuable tool. With this," he held up the papers, "we may yet uncover the truth." After Mercer left, Holmes turned to me, his expression grim. "Watson, we must act quickly. The archivists will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who poses a threat to their operation." "What's our next move?" I asked. Holmes spread the papers across the table, his fingers tracing the symbols. "We follow the code. It will lead us to their archive and to the heart of their conspiracy." We spent the next hour deciphering the symbols, each one revealing a new piece of the puzzle. The code was intricate, its layers of meaning designed to confound anyone who did not possess the key. But Holmes, with his unparalleled intellect, unravelled it with ease. "Here," he said at last, pointing to a symbol on the map. "This is where we'll find the archive. And if I'm not mistaken, it's also where we'll find the answers we seek." I studied the map, my unease growing. The location was deep in the warehouse district, a labyrinth of crumbling buildings and narrow alleys. It was the perfect place to hide something, or someone. "Holmes," I said, my voice low, "this feels like a trap." "It very well may be," he replied, "but it's a trap we must spring if we are to uncover the truth." That night, we made our way to the warehouse district, the fog clinging to the streets like a shroud. The buildings loomed around us, their windows dark and lifeless. Holmes moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Watson," he whispered as we approached a particularly decrepit building, "stay close and be ready for anything." We entered the building through a side door, the air inside thick with dust and decay. The interior was a maze of corridors and rooms, each one more disorienting than the last. Holmes led the way, his steps sure and deliberate. At last, we reached a large room at the centre of the building. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with books and documents. In the centre of the room stood a machine, its gears and levers gleaming in the dim light. "The archive," Holmes murmured, his voice filled with awe. "And the machine they use to rewrite history." Before I could respond, a voice echoed through the room, cold and disembodied. "You should not have come here, Mr. Holmes." We turned to see a figure step out of the shadows, his face obscured by a hood. In his hand he held a device, a small metallic object that hummed with energy. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And who are you?" The figure smiled, though it was more a baring of teeth than an expression of warmth. "I am the keeper of the archive, and you, Mr. Holmes, are trespassing." Holmes took a step forward, his voice steady. "We are here to expose your crimes, the erasure of individuals, the manipulation of history. It ends tonight." The figure laughed, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. "You are brave, Mr. Holmes, but bravery will not save you from the truth." He raised the device, growing louder. Holmes grabbed my arm, pulling me back as the room began to shift around us. The walls blurred, the shelves dissolved, and for a moment I felt as though I were falling. Then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The room was as it had been, the figure gone. But something was different. The machine was silent, its gears still. And on the floor, where the figure had stood, lay a single sheet of paper. Holmes picked it up, his eyes scanning the symbols. "Watson," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of triumph and dread. "We have found what we came for. But the cost?" He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the paper. I looked over his shoulder, my heart pounding. The symbols spelled out a single chilling message. The truth will be forgotten. Chapter 6. The Vanishing Witness. The warehouse was cloaked in silence, the air heavy with the weight of what we had just uncovered. Holmes held the sheet of paper in his hand, his expression inscrutable. I could almost see the gears turning in, his mind as he pieced together the implications of the chilling message, "The truth will be forgotten." "Holmes," I said, my voice low, "what does it mean? Are they threatening us?" He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. "Not a threat, Watson. A warning. The archivists are not merely erasing individuals, they are erasing the very knowledge of their existence. And if we are not careful, we may suffer the same fate." A chill ran down my spine. But how? How can they manipulate memory on such a scale? Holmes's eyes gleamed with a mixture of fascination and unease. "The machine we saw, it is no ordinary device. It is a tool for rewriting reality itself. And if we are to stop them, we must understand how it works." Before I could respond, a sound from the shadows made us both turn. A figure emerged, stumbling into the dim light. It was Charles Mercer, the man who had come to us earlier. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. "Mr. Holmes!" he gasped, clutching his chest. "They're coming! You must leave, now!" Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Who is coming, Mr. Mercer?" "The archivists." Mercer nodded, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "They know I betrayed them. They'll erase me, just like they erased the others." As he spoke, his voice began to falter, his words slurring as if he were struggling to remember them. I moved to steady him, but Holmes held up a hand. "Watson, stand back," he said, his tone urgent. I hesitated, but the look in Holmes's eyes brooked no argument. Mercer swayed on his feet, his expression growing increasingly vacant. I can't remember," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "My name, my face, it's all fading." Holmes's jaw tightened. "Fight it, Mercer. Focus on what you know. Tell us where to find them." Mercer opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His eyes glazed over, and he collapsed to the floor, his body limp. I rushed to his side, feeling for a pulse. "He's alive," I said, relief flooding through me. "But he's unconscious." Holmes knelt beside me, his gaze fixed on Mercer's face. "Watson, do you notice anything unusual?" I frowned, studying Mercer more closely. His features seemed indistinct, as if they were blurring at the edges. It was as though he were fading before our very eyes. "Holmes," I said, my voice trembling, "what's happening to him?" Holmes's expression was grim. "The archivist's machine. It's rewriting his existence, erasing him from reality. And if we don't act quickly, he'll be gone forever." We carried Mercer out of the warehouse and into the fog-shrouded streets. The journey back to Baker Street was a blur, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. By the time we arrived, Mercer's condition had worsened. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door, her face pale with concern. "Mr. Holmes, what's happened?" "No time to explain," Holmes replied, his tone brusque. "Prepare the guest room. Watson, fetch my medical kit." We worked quickly, doing everything we could to stabilize Mercer. But as the hours passed, it became clear that his condition was beyond our ability to treat. His features continued to blur, his identity slipping away like sand through our fingers. "Holmes," I said, my voice heavy with despair, "there must be something we can do." Holmes sat by the bed, his eyes fixed on Mercer's face. "There is," he said at last. "We must find the central archive and destroy the machine. It is the only way to reverse the process." "But how?" I asked. "We don't even know where it is." Holmes reached into his pocket and pulled out the sheet of paper we had found in the warehouse. "The code, Watson. It holds the key, and if I'm not mistaken—" He paused, his eyes narrowing. "It points to a location near the Thames, a place where the past and present converge." I felt a surge of hope, though it was tempered by the knowledge of what we were up against. The archivists were not merely a secret society, they were architects of reality itself, and as I looked at Mercer, his features fading before my eyes, I knew we were running out of time. The following morning, we set out for the location Holmes had identified. The streets were quiet, the fog clinging to the buildings like a shroud. Holmes moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. "Watson," he said as we approached a narrow alley, "stay close and be ready for anything." We entered the alley, the air thick with the scent of damp stone and decay. At the end of the alley stood a door, its surface covered in the same angular symbols we had seen before. Holmes studied the symbols for a moment before pushing the door open. The room beyond was dark, the only light coming from a single lamp on a table in the center. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with books and documents. The center of the room stood the machine, its gears and levers gleaming in the dim light. "The central archive," Holmes murmured, his voice filled with awe. Before I could respond, a voice echoed through the room, cold and disembodied. "You should not have come here, Mr. Holmes." We turned to see a figure step out of the shadows, his face obscured by a hood. In his hand he held a device, a small metallic object that hummed with energy. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And who are you?" The figure smiled, though it was more a baring of teeth than an expression of warmth. "I am the keeper of the archive, and you, Mr. Holmes, are trespassing." Holmes took a step forward, his voice steady. "We are here to expose your crimes, the erasure of individuals, the manipulation of history. It ends tonight." The figure laughed, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. "You are brave, Mr. Holmes, but bravery will not save you from the truth." He raised the device, its gaudier hum growing louder. Holmes grabbed my arm, pulling me back as the room began to shift around us. The walls blurred, the shelves dissolved, and for a moment I felt as though I were falling. Then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The room was as it had been, the figure gone. But something was different. The machine was silent, its gears still, and on the floor, where the figure had stood, lay a single sheet of paper. Holmes picked it up, his eyes scanning the symbols. "Watson," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of triumph and dread. "We have found what we came for. But the cost?" He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the paper. I looked over his shoulder, my heart pounding. The symbols spelled out a single chilling message. The truth will be forgotten. Chapter 7. Holmes's Strategic Play. The room was eerily silent, the hum of the machine now absent. Holmes held the sheet of paper in his hand, his expression a mixture of triumph and unease. The message, the truth will be forgotten. Yingdu, in the air like a spectre, its implications chilling. "Holmes," I said, my voice low, "what now? If they can erase memories, how can we possibly stop them?" Holmes folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. "By staying one step ahead, Watson. The archivists rely on secrecy and manipulation. If we expose their operations, we strip them of their power." "But how do we expose them without being erased ourselves?" I asked, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Holmes's eyes gleamed with determination. "By using their own tools against them. That machine, it is the key. If we can dismantle it, we can halt their ability to rewrite reality." Before I could respond, a sound from the shadows made us both turn. A faint creak echoed through the room, followed by the soft shuffle of footsteps. Holmes motioned for silence, his hand moving to the pocket where he kept his revolver. "Show yourself," he called, his voice steady but commanding. For a moment there was no response. Then a figure emerged from the darkness. A woman, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She clutched a bundle of papers to her chest, her hands trembling. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You must help me. They're coming." Holmes stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "Who are you?" "My name is Eliza Graves," she said, her voice shaking. I am one of them, but I can't do it anymore. I can't let them erase people like they're nothing." Holmes studied her for a moment before nodding. "Very well, Miss Graves, tell us everything." Eliza led us to a small alcove hidden behind one of the shelves. The space was cramped, but it was out of sight from the main room. She sat down, her hands still trembling as she spoke. "The archivists have been operating for centuries," she began. "They manipulate history, erase individuals, and rewrite reality to suit their agenda. That machine," she gestured towards the silent device in the center of the room, "is their most powerful tool. It can alter memories, change records, even erase entire lives." "And you helped them?" I asked, unable to hide the note of accusation in my voice. Eliza's eyes filled with tears. "I had no choice. They threatened my family. But I can't do it anymore. Not after what they did to Henry Acton." Holmes leaned forward, his expression intense. "What do you know about Acton?" "He discovered the truth," Eliza replied. "He found out about the archive and tried to expose it, but they erased him completely. His wife, his friends, even his own memories of him. It was as if he never existed." I felt a chill run down my spine. "And now they're doing the Same to Mercer, Eliza nodded. Yes, and if we don't stop them, they'll do it to you too. Holmes's jaw tightened. Then we must act quickly. Miss Graves, can you disable the machine? She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the device. I think so, but it's dangerous if they catch us. They won't, Holmes interrupted. Not if we move swiftly. Watson, stay with Miss Graves. I'll keep watch. We worked quickly, Eliza guiding me through the process of dismantling the machine. The device was intricate, its gears and levers humming faintly as we worked. I could feel the weight of what we were doing, the knowledge that one wrong move could have catastrophic consequences. Watson, Eliza said, her voice trembling, there's something else you should know. The archivists have a failsafe. If the machine is destroyed, it triggers a cascade effect, a kind of memory reset. Everyone connected to the archive will forget everything. I paused, my hands hovering over the gears. Including us? Nodded. Including us? I felt a surge of panic, but before I could respond, Holmes's voice cut through the silence. Watson, we have company. I turned to see figures emerging from the shadows, men in dark cloaks, their faces obscured by hoods. They moved with purpose, their steps silent but deliberate. The archivists, Eliza whispered, her voice filled with dread. Holmes stepped forward, his revolver in hand. Stay behind me, he said, his voice calm but firm. The lead figure raised a hand, his voice cold and commanding. You are outnumbered, Mr. Holmes. Surrender, and we may yet spare you. Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile. I think not. Watson, now would be an excellent time to finish dismantling that machine. I turned back to the device, my hands trembling as I worked. The archivists advanced, their movements slow but deliberate. Holmes stood his ground, his revolver trained on the lead figure. You cannot win, the figure said, his voice dripping with disdain. The truth will be forgotten. Not if I have anything to say about it, Holmes replied, his voice steady. The room was tense, the air thick with the weight of what was to come. I worked feverishly, my hands moving with a speed born of desperation. Eliza stood beside me, her eyes wide with fear. Watson, she whispered, we're running out of time. I know, I replied, my voice strained. Just a little longer. The archivists were almost upon us, their figures looming in the dim light. Holmes stood firm, his revolver unwavering. Watson, he called, his voice calm, but urgent, any moment now. Almost there, I replied, my hands moving frantically, and then, with a final twist, the machine fell silent. The hum that had filled the room ceased, the gears grinding to a halt. For a moment, there was silence. Then the room began to shift. The walls blurred, the shelves dissolved, and the archivist's figures wavered like mirages. What have you done? The lead figure demanded, his voice filled with rage. Holmes smiled, his expression one of grim satisfaction. We've levelled the playing field. As the room continued to shift, I felt a strange sensation, a kind of lightness, as if something was slipping away. Eliza grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with panic. Watson, she said, her voice trembling, it's starting. The memory reset. I felt a surge of fear, but before I could respond, the room dissolved into darkness. Chapter 8. The Archivist's Lair. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating void that seemed to press in from all sides. I felt disoriented, my mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. The machine, the archivists, the shifting room, all felt like fragments of a dream slipping through my fingers. "Watson!" Holmes's voice cut through the blackness, calm and steady. "Stay close. Do not move until I say." I obeyed, my breath shallow, as I strained to see anything in the impenetrable dark. Slowly faint shapes began to emerge, a dim light filtering through what appeared to be cracks in a wall. The room was no longer the archive, it was something else entirely. "Holmes," I whispered, "where are we?" "Somewhere they did not intend us to be," he replied, his voice low. "The machine's deactivation has disrupted their control. We are in the heart of their operations now, their true lair." The light grew brighter, revealing a narrow corridor lined with strange pulsating devices. The walls were covered in the same angular symbols we had seen before, but these seemed to shift and writhe as if alive. The air was thick with a metallic tang, and the faint hum of machinery echoed through the space. Holmes moved forward with purpose, his eyes scanning the corridor for any sign of danger. I followed, my revolver drawn, though I felt woefully unprepared for whatever lay ahead. "Watson!" Holmes said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. "Do you hear that?" I listened, my ears straining. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, I heard it. A low, rhythmic chanting, coming from somewhere deeper in the lair. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The archivists," Holmes replied, his tone grim. "They are preparing something. We must act quickly." We moved down the corridor, the chanting growing louder with each step. The air grew colder, the walls closing in around us. At last, we reached a large chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. In the centre of the room stood a massive machine, far larger and more intricate than the one we had dismantled. Around it, hooded figures moved in unison, their voices rising in a haunting cadence. Holmes studied the scene, his eyes narrowing. "This is their central hub," he murmured, "the source of their power." "What do we do?" I asked, my grip tightening on my revolver. Holmes' lips curved into a faint smile. "We disrupt their ritual, but we must be careful. One misstep, and we risk triggering their failsafe." Before I could respond, one of the figures turned, their hooded face scanning the room. Holmes pulled me into the shadows, his hand gripping my arm. "Watson," he whispered, "listen carefully. We must disable that machine, but we cannot do it alone. We need to create a diversion." "A diversion?" I repeated, my mind racing. Holmes nodded. "When I give the signal, fire your revolver into the air. It will draw their attention long enough for me to reach the machine." I hesitated, the weight of the plan settling on my shoulders. "And what about you? If they catch you, they won't," Holmes interrupted, his voice firm. "Trust me, Watson." I nodded, though my unease remained. Holmes moved silently through the shadows, his figure blending seamlessly with the darkness. I watched as he approached the machine, his movements precise and deliberate. The chanting grew louder, the figures around the machine swaying in unison. I felt a strange pressure in the air, as if the room itself were alive. My hand trembled as I raised my revolver, waiting for Holmes's signal, and then it came, a sharp whistle that cut through the chanting like a knife. I fired, the shot echoing through the chamber. The figures turned, their chanting faltering as they searched for the source of the noise. Holmes seized the opportunity, moving swiftly to the machine. "Intruders!" one of the figures shouted, their voice filled with rage. The room erupted into chaos as the archivist surged toward me. I fired again, the shot grazing one of the figures. They faltered but did not fall, their movements unnaturally fluid. "Watson, hold them off!" Holmes called, his hands moving frantically over the machine. I fired again and again, my shots keeping the archivists at bay. But they were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. I felt a surge of panic as they closed in, their hooded faces looming in the dim light. And then, with a final twist, Holmes disabled the machine. The room shuddered, the walls rippling like water. The archivists froze, their figures wavering as if caught in a sudden wind. Holmes grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the exit. "Run, Watson!" he shouted. We sprinted down the corridor, the walls collapsing around us. The archivists chanting turned to screams as their lair dissolved into chaos. The air grew thick, the pressure building until it felt as though the world itself were unraveling. At last, we burst into the open air, the cold night wind a welcome relief. I turned to look back, but the lair was gone, replaced by an empty lot, its surface covered in ash. "Holmes!" I gasped, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "What happened?" He stood beside me, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "We've destroyed their central hub. The archivist's power is broken." I felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The memory of the machine's failsafe, the cascade effect, flashed through my mind. "Holmes," I said, my voice trembling. "What about the memory reset? Will we—" He cut me off with a shake of his head. "No, Watson. The failsafe was tied to the central hub. With it destroyed, the cascade effect is neutralized. Our memories are safe." I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me, the weight of the night's events settling on my shoulders. Holmes placed a hand on my arm, his grip firm. "Come, Watson," he said. "We have much to discuss, but for now, let us return to Baker Street. The game is afoot, and we are not yet finished." Chapter 9. The Final Deduction. The walk back to Baker Street was a blur, the foggy streets of London eerily silent after the chaos we had just endured. My mind raced with questions, but Holmes remained characteristically composed, his sharp eyes scanning our surroundings as if expecting an ambush at any moment. "Holmes," I said at last, breaking the silence. "What happens now? The archivist's hub is destroyed, but surely they won't simply vanish." Holmes glanced at me, his expression inscrutable. "No, Watson, they will not vanish, but their power is diminished and their operations disrupted. For now, that is enough." "For now?" I repeated, my unease growing. "You think they'll regroup?" "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied. "But they will need time we can use to expose them fully. The machine's destruction is only the first step." I frowned. my thoughts turning to the strange symbols, the shifting walls, and the chilling message: the truth will be forgotten. "Holmes," I said slowly, "what did you see in that machine? What did you learn?" He paused, his gaze distant. "Enough to know that the archivist's reach extends far beyond what we imagined. They are not merely a secret society, they are a force that has shaped history itself. But their power lies in secrecy. Once exposed, they are vulnerable." Before I could press further, we arrived at Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson greeted us at the door, her face pale with concern. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice trembling. There's a gentleman here to see you. He's waiting in the sitting room." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "A gentleman? At this hour?" Mrs. Hudson nodded. He insisted it was urgent. We entered the sitting room to find a man seated by the fire, his face obscured by the shadows. He rose as we entered, his movements deliberate. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low and measured, "I've been expecting you." Holmes studied him for a moment before speaking. "And who, may I ask, are you?" The man stepped into the light, revealing a face that was both familiar and strange. He was tall and gaunt, his features sharp and his eyes piercing. "My name is Alaric Graves," he said, "Eliza's brother." I felt a jolt of surprise. "Eliza, the woman who helped us?" Graves nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, and now she's gone." "Gone?" Holmes repeated, his tone sharp. "Explain." Graves hesitated, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "After you left the archive, the archivists came for her. They erased her, just like they did to Henry Acton." I felt a chill run down my spine. "But we destroyed their machine. How could they—" "The machine you destroyed was only one of many," Graves interrupted. "The archivist's network is vast, Mr. Holmes. You've struck a blow, but the war is far from over." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And why come to us now? What do you hope to gain?" Graves stepped closer, his gaze intense. "I want to help you. I want to bring them down. For Eliza, for Acton, for all the others they've erased. But I can't do it alone." Holmes studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Very well, Mr. Graves. Tell us everything you know." Graves spent the next hour recounting the archivist's operations in meticulous detail. He spoke of their hidden archives, their agents embedded in every level of society, and their ultimate goal, to control history itself. They believe that by shaping the past, they can control the future, Graves said, his voice filled with bitterness, and they will stop at nothing to achieve it. Holmes listened intently, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And their leader? Who is he?" Graves hesitated, his expression darkening. "He goes by many names, but his true identity is known only to a few. He is called the Keeper, the one who oversees the archives and ensures their secrets remain hidden." "The Keeper," Holmes repeated, his tone thoughtful. "And where might we find him?" Graves shook his head. "I don't know, but there is one place, a hidden vault beneath the Thames. It's said to hold their most guarded secrets. If anyone knows how to stop them, it's there." Holmes rose, his eyes gleaming with determination. "Then that is where we must go, journey to the vault was fraught with tension. The streets were eerily quiet, the fog clinging to the buildings like a shroud. Graves led the way, his movements swift and silent. Holmes followed close behind, his sharp eyes scanning our surroundings for any sign of danger. At last, we reached a nondescript building near the river. Graves produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the door, revealing a narrow staircase that led underground. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "The vault." We descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a large chamber, its walls lined with shelves filled with books and documents. In the centre of the room stood a figure, his "Back to us, Mr. Holmes," the figure said without turning. "I've been expecting you." Holmes stepped forward, his revolver drawn. "And you must be the keeper." The figure turned, revealing a face that was both familiar and strange. It was Edgar Whitcomb, the businessman we had interrogated days before. "Indeed," Whitcomb said, his smile cold. "And you, Mr. Holmes, have proven to be a most formidable adversary." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Your game is over, Whitcomb. The archivist's power is broken." Whitcomb laughed, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Broken? No, Mr. Holmes. We are merely regrouping, and you, I'm afraid, have outlived your usefulness. Before I could react, the room began to shift, the walls blurring as if reality itself were unravelling. I felt a strange lightness, as if something were slipping away. "Watson!" Holmes shouted, his voice urgent. "Fight it! Focus on what? You know." I tried to hold on, but the darkness closed in, swallowing everything. Entered Chapter 10, The Forgotten Truth. The darkness was absolute, a void that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. I felt weightless, untethered, as if I were floating in a sea of nothingness. My mind struggled to grasp what was happening, fragments of memory slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. "Watson." The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. "Holmes, Watson, focus, remember." I tried to cling to his words, to anchor myself in the chaos. Images flashed before me. Holmes's sharp gaze, the shifting walls of the vault, Whitcomb's cold smile. But they were fleeting, dissolving before I could fully grasp them. "Holmes," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "What's happening?" "The cascade effect," he replied, his tone urgent. "The archivist's failsafe. It's rewriting our memories, erasing everything we've learned." I felt a surge of panic. "But the machine, we destroyed it." "Decay all of them," Holmes said grimly. "Whitcomb activated a secondary device. We must fight it, Watson. Focus on what you know. Hold on to the truth." I tried, but the memories slipped away faster than I could hold them. The vault, the keeper, the dancing men code, it all blurred together, fading into the void. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the darkness lifted. I awoke in my chair at Baker Street, the fire crackling in the hearth and the familiar scent of tobacco filling the air. Holmes sat across from me, his pipe in hand, his expression one of quiet contemplation. "Watson," he said, his voice calm, "you've been dozing." I blinked, disoriented. I must have been more tired than I realized. Holmes studied me for a moment before nodding. "Indeed, it has been a long day." I frowned, a strange sense of unease settling over me. Holmes, did we solve a case today? He raised an eyebrow. A case? No, Watson. You've been working on your notes, as you often do. Perhaps you were dreaming. I glanced at the table, where my notebook lay open. The pages were filled with my handwriting, but the words were unfamiliar, a jumble of disjointed thoughts and half-formed ideas. I suppose I must have been, I said, though the unease remained. Holmes leaned forward, his gaze sharp. Tell me, Watson, what do you remember? I hesitated, my mind racing. I'm not sure. It's all a blur. I feel as though something important happened, but I can't quite recall what. Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile. Memory is a curious thing, is it not? Sometimes the most significant events are the ones we forget. I felt a chill run down my spine. Holmes, what are you saying? He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Merely an observation, Watson, nothing more. The days that followed were uneventful, the routine of our lives at Baker Street resuming as if nothing had happened. But the sense of unease lingered, a nagging feeling that something was missing. One evening, as I sat by the fire, I noticed a sheet of paper tucked beneath my notebook. I pulled it out, my heart skipping a beat as I recognized the angular symbols of the Dancing Men Code. Holmes, I said, my voice trembling. What is this? He glanced at the paper, his expression calm. A curiosity, Watson. A puzzle I've been meaning to solve. I studied the symbols, a strange sense of déjà vu washing over me. It feels familiar, as if I've seen it before. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar spark of intrigue. Perhaps you have, Watson. Perhaps you have. As the days turned into weeks, the memory of the vault and the archivists faded, replaced by the comforting rhythm of our lives at Baker Street. But every now and then I would catch Holmes studying me with that same inscrutable expression as if he were waiting for me to remember something. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, I would dream of a room filled with shifting walls and a machine that hummed with power. But when I awoke, the details slipped away, leaving only a faint sense of unease. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Holmes broke the silence. Watson, he said, his voice low, do you ever wonder if some truths are better left forgotten? Frowned, the question stirring something deep within me. I suppose it depends on the truth. Holmes nodded, his gaze distant. Indeed, some truths are too dangerous to remember, but others are worth fighting for. I felt a chill run down my spine, though I couldn't say why. Holmes, what are you talking about? He turned, to me, his expression one of quiet resolve. Nothing, Watson, merely a thought. And with that, he returned to his pipe, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face. Chapter 11. Epilogue. The truth that remains, the weeks turned into months, and life at Baker Street settled into its familiar rhythm. The strange unease that had lingered in the wake of my fragmented memories began to fade, replaced by the comforting routines of our daily lives. Holmes, as ever, remained engrossed in his work, his sharp mind turning to new puzzles and cases with relentless focus. Yet Every so often I would catch him studying me with that same inscrutable expression, as if waiting for me to recall something I could not quite grasp. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Holmes broke the silence with a question that caught me off guard. "Watson," he said, his voice low and measured, "do you ever feel as though something is missing? As though a piece of yourself has been misplaced?" I looked up from my notebook, startled by the question. "Missing? I'm not sure I follow, Holmes." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "Memory is a curious thing, Watson. It shapes who we are, yet it is so easily altered. Tell me, do you recall the case of the Dancing Men Code?" I frowned, the question stirring something deep within me. "The Dancing Men Code? I'm not certain. It sounds familiar, but I can't quite place it." Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile. "A curious case, Watson. One that tested the limits of logic and reason. But it is not the details that matter. It is the truth that remains." I felt a chill run down my spine, though I couldn't say why. "Holmes, what are you getting at?" He turned to me, his expression one of quiet resolve. "Merely an observation, Watson. Some truths are too dangerous to remember, but others are worth fighting for." Before I could respond, there was a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, her face pale. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling, "there's a gentleman here to see you. He says it's urgent." Holmes rose, his eyes gleaming with that familiar spark of intrigue. "Show him in, Mrs. Hudson." The man who entered was tall and gaunt, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He carried a leather satchel, which he clutched tightly to his chest. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low and urgent, "my name is Charles Mercer. I need your help." I felt a jolt of recognition at the name, though I couldn't place why. Holmes, however, seemed unfazed. "Mr. Mercer," he said, his tone calm but firm, "what brings you here?" Mercer hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, as if expecting to be watched. "It's about the archivists," he said at last. "They're back." I felt a surge of panic, the fragmented memories of the vault, and the shifting walls flooding back in a rush. "Holmes," I said, my voice trembling, "what is he talking about?" Holmes turned to me, his expression one of quiet determination. "The truth, Watson. The truth we fought so hard to uncover." Mercer spent the next hour recounting the archivists' resurgence, their operations more covert and insidious than before. Holmes listened intently, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "They've learned from their mistakes," Mercer said, his voice filled with bitterness. "They've adapted, and they're more dangerous than ever." Holmes nodded, his expression grim. "Then we must adapt as well. Watson, are you with me?" I felt a surge of determination, the fragmented memories coalescing into a single, unshakable resolve. Always Holmes. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Holmes and I working tirelessly to uncover the archivists' new operations. The Dancing Men Code reappeared, its angular symbols leading us to hidden archives and secret meetings. The archivists, it seemed, were determined to rewrite history once more. But this time we were ready. One evening, as we sat by the fire, Holmes broke the silence. "Watson," he said, his voice low, "do you ever wonder if some truths are better left forgotten? I frowned, the question stirring something deep within me. I suppose it depends on the truth. Holmes nodded, his gaze distant. Indeed, some truths are too dangerous to remember. But others are worth fighting for. I felt a chill run down my spine, though I couldn't say why. Holmes, what are you talking about? He turned to me, his expression one of quiet resolve. Nothing, Watson. Merely a thought. And with that, he returned to his pipe, the firelight casting flickering shadows across his face.